Money FM 89.3. Best of breakfast. The bigger picture, only on Money FM 89.3.
Good morning. Welcome to the bigger picture of me, Ryan Huang. As Southeast Asia navigates a volatile mix of political unrest and economic uncertainty, investors and policymakers alike are watching developments in Indonesia and Thailand with growing concern. In recent weeks, protests have flared across Indonesia, while Thailand faces fresh political instability following the ouster of Prime Minister Paetongtarn Shinawatra. Against this backdrop, questions loom large over economic resilience, monetary policy direction, and investor sentiment across ASEAN. And to help us out this morning, we've got Lavanya Venkateswaran. She is the Senior ASEAN Economist for OCBC. Good morning, Lavanya. How are you doing today?
Good morning, Ryan. Thank you for having me.
Hey, great to have you on. So let's start first with what's playing out in Indonesia. And we've seen protests escalating in recent weeks on issues from parliament perks to wage demands. How much of a risk do you see all these flashpoints posing to Indonesia's economic stability?
Overnight, the protests were actually a lot lower. So the peak of the protest was over the weekend, Ryan. And since then, we did see President Prabowo coming out with a statement. And in the last 2 nights or so, the protests have eased off. Right? But I think the bigger question here is how will the government reassess any of its fiscal policies, and if they do, what is the nature and the extent of that reassessment in order to actually satisfy the underlying demands of protesters. So there is a more fundamental dissatisfaction that seems to have erupted on the streets, and the question now would be, will there be clearer solutions to these underlying causes that stoked the protests in the first place, or will it be a one-stop solution for now and the government takes it as it comes?
Yeah, Lavanya, to your point, Prabowo has revoked controversial MP perks and also signaled tougher policing of unrest. So that, to some degree, might help. But do you think we need to see deeper structural reforms to really address these issues?
Yes, I think that would go a long way in trying to address the grievances that we've seen spill over into the streets. Essentially, the grievances have stemmed from rising cost of living, job losses, the demand for higher minimum wages. Now, of course, when each of these demands are listed on paper, they also come with certain policy prescriptions, which are easier said than done, right? When it comes to minimum wages, for example, when you demand higher minimum wages, it's usually concomitant with labor productivity. So you need to give minimum wages commensurate to labor productivity. And when that doesn't happen, it reduces competitiveness. So there are a lot of policies that need to work hand in hand in order to try and address the deeper issues here. But of course, I think the most pressing issue at the moment is the fiscal concern, which is how will the cutbacks in or how will the expenditure profile be readjusted, and whether there will be any truly revenue-creating measures that could be introduced.
Lavanya, let's talk about the outlook for Indonesia's economy. You've got the GDP growth forecast at 4.7%. How would you describe the economy right now, especially when you have in the backdrop quite weak household sentiment as well as rising food inflation?
So the economy right now was surprisingly resilient in the first half of the year. We did see the Q2 GDP print surprise to the upside. But when we're looking at the monthly activity data, there is a sense that the activity data does not really marry with the GDP number, because we have seen a slowdown in consumer confidence. We've seen weaker credit growth, weaker car sales, weaker cement sales. So there's a whole host of activity data which has actually come in softer. But at the same time, household consumption has been stable. So it's a question of when the weakness in the activity data starts translating onto household consumption. As you said, I think there are some pressure points going forward, including higher food inflation, the need for higher minimum wages. So all of these need to be watched very carefully, in addition to anecdotal evidence of job losses. So the equation for the households will get a bit more complicated as we go into the second half of the year, and that's precisely why we have a slower economic growth forecast for the second half at 4.5% versus 5% in the first half.
All right, Lavanya, let's switch tracks to Thailand, where we are looking at a country again in political flux. Prime Minister Paetongtarn Shinawatra has been removed by the Constitutional Court. So how significant is this latest episode for investor confidence and Thailand's economic outlook?
Well, let's start off by saying the timing is quite unfortunate, because at the moment Thailand is being accosted by both domestic and external risks. On the external front, we're all well aware of the tariff risks that are hurting economies across the region. But in Thailand's case, it's no stranger to political uncertainty, we've seen these cycles repeat themselves with the fairly regular intervals over the last couple of years or so. And I think for investor confidence, it couldn't be a worse time, right? Because investors are looking for stability domestically to be able to try and readjust supply chains, to be able to deal with the external uncertainties. And at that time, if political domestic uncertainty continues to prevail, I think ASEAN is becoming competitive enough for investors to look elsewhere and look outside Thailand. And I think that would be Thailand's biggest disadvantage at the moment.
Okay, let's unpack this a bit. When you look at the industries, the sectors in Thailand, we've got the GDP growth already softening, forecast at just 1.8% this year. What are some of the implications of some of these industries? What sort of downside risks are we looking at?
So the downside risks are mostly on the manufacturing side. We have seen manufacturing holding up in the first half of the year, and that's largely because it was supported by a front-loading of exports to the US. With tariffs in place now, we do see some of the front-loading impact coming off. At the same time, private investments onshore, as underscored by the private investment index, have been fairly soft as well. And the July print for the private investment numbers have also come in on the weaker side, which means that investment spending is likely to be waiting on the sidelines until some of this domestic political uncertainty clears. And I think that will also impact the growth outlook. So for the second half of this year, we actually have growth slowing very sharply to 0.5% compared to about 3.5% in the first half, which gives us a full forecast of 1.8% for this year.
All right, let's take a step back. So we've got the protests in Indonesia and also the political upheaval in Thailand. Where does ASEAN sit right now when it comes to the overall investor sentiment? And of course, in Singapore, is this in some sense a boost because of how a lot of investors look towards Singapore as a safe haven of sorts?
I mean, I think at this point it's a bit of an unfortunate coincidence that Thailand and Indonesia have experienced domestic political upheaval simultaneously. But as the dust settles, at least in Indonesia's case, it's settling faster than Thailand. We do expect that there will be some normalcy that returns. But ultimately, I think these two economies are at risk of investment divergence, where investments will probably go to economies that are perceived to be more stable, such as Malaysia, Philippines, or even Vietnam, right? And I think Singapore is also one of those economies. But the bottom line here is that as political risks are perceived to have increased in these two countries, the diversification of investments to other countries will probably be on the mind of most investors.
All right, definitely a lot to watch out for in the second half plus. And help us to lay out what's in store. We've been in conversation with Lavanya Venkateswaran. She is the Senior ASEAN Economist for OCBC. Lavanya, thank you so much for your time this morning.
Thank you very much.
All right, stay with us on Money FM 89.3.
Before acting on the information on Money FM, please consider if it's suitable for your own investment objectives, financial situation, and risk tolerance. To listen to more great interviews, download our podcasts at audio.sg or download the audio app. That's AWEDIO, audio at the App Store and Google Play.